I'll give you $5,000 if you serve me in Spanish. Dominic Callahan laughed, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter of Moretti's restaurant. His entourage snickered as he leaned back in his chair, steel-gray eyes fixed on the young waitress whose name tag read Elena. Elena clutched her notepad tighter, her knuckles turning white as she forced a polite smile. Behind that practiced expression was a mind racing with calculations. Rent was due in 3 days. Her mother's lupus medication costs had doubled since last month, and her graduate scholarship barely covered textbooks, nothing more. The Mafia boss who controlled all of Chicago's South Side, known simply as Dominic, smirked at her hesitation, clearly enjoying the power imbalance between them. His tailored charcoal suit and the Patek Philippe on his wrist screamed wealth, while the bulge beneath his jacket whispered danger to anyone observant enough to notice. I studied Spanish for 4 years in college before dropping out to support my family, Elena replied in flawless Spanish, her Mexico City accent so authentic that even Dominic froze for a split second. The restaurant fell silent as his smug expression transformed into one of genuine surprise. Dominic's eyebrows shot up, his lips parting slightly, a reaction he couldn't mask as he registered what had just happened. The men surrounding him shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unused to seeing their leader caught off guard by anyone, especially not a waitress in a modest Italian restaurant on Chicago's South Side. The silence satisfying lasted 3 full seconds before Dominic's expression shifted not into anger, not into embarrassment, but into something far more dangerous. Interest. His smirk melted away, replaced by a slow, deliberate smile that Elena had never seen on a customer's face before. It was the smile of a man who had just discovered something valuable in a place he hadn't thought to look. "Well," Dominic said quietly, straightening in his chair as his entourage exchanged uncertain glances. He reached into the inside pocket of his charcoal suit, the same side where that ominous bulge lived, and pulled out a business card. Heavy cardstock, embossed lettering that caught the overhead light. He slid it across the table with 2 fingers, positioning it precisely in front of Elena as if placing a chess piece. Callahan Global Logistics. The word sat above an address she recognized instantly. Willis Tower, floor 52. A phone number. Nothing else. No explanation needed. The name Callahan carried its own gravity in Chicago. $5,000 as promised, Dominic said, his steel-gray eyes never leaving hers. And maybe a conversation about putting those talents to better use. He held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, long enough for Elena to feel the weight of what was being offered and what was being asked before rising from his chair. His men followed immediately, chairs scraping against tile. The choreography of obedience so rehearsed it looked almost natural. The restaurant exhaled as the group moved toward the door. Conversations resumed in cautious murmurs, but every pair of eyes in Moretti's drifted toward Elena, still standing at the empty table with the card between her fingers. Tony Moretti materialized at her elbow before the front door had fully closed. The 58-year-old owner gripped her arm with the firmness of a man who had survived decades in a neighborhood where survival was never guaranteed. His voice dropped to a whisper that carried the texture of gravel and cigarette smoke. Dominic Callahan never gives anyone anything for free. That card in your hand? It's not a gift. Sweetheart, it's a leash. You'd be smart to throw it in the trash and forget tonight ever happened. Elena nodded, slipping the card into her apron pocket where it pressed against her thigh like a secret burning through fabric. She finished her shift on autopilot, refilling water glasses, reciting specials, smiling at tips that wouldn't cover a single bottle of her mother's medication. When the last customer left, and Tony locked the door behind her, Elena stepped into the South Side night, with pepper spray clutched in one hand, and $5,000 worth of possibility weighing down her apron pocket. The walk home took 14 minutes through streets where broken streetlights outnumbered working ones. Her studio apartment greeted her with its familiar symphony of inadequacy. The leaking kitchen faucet, marking time in irregular drips. The threadbare carpet worn to its backing along the path between bed and bathroom. The thin walls through which she could hear her mother's labored breathing in the bedroom next door. Elena paced that worn carpet for hours, turning the card over in her fingers until the edges softened. Taking money from a criminal violated every moral boundary she had built for herself since childhood. Boundaries constructed brick by a grandmother in Oaxaca, who taught her that dignity was the one thing poverty couldn't steal. But dignity didn't cover prescriptions. Principles didn't stop lupus from consuming Rosa Vasquez one flare at a time. Necessity has a way of redrawing those lines. Morning arrived after a sleepless night, thin sunlight filtering through curtains that had been white once, years ago. The business card sat on the kitchen counter where Elena had finally placed it, the embossed letters catching the early light as if breathing. Callahan Global Logistics. A phone number, an address on the 52nd floor. Elena picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over the keypad. From the bedroom, Rosa coughed a deep, wet sound that rattled through the thin wall, the same cough that had been getting worse every day for the past 3 months. The cough that no amount of dignity or principle could silence. Elena dialed. At 11:58 a.m., Elena pushed through the revolving doors of Willis Tower into a world that had never been meant for her. The lobby soared in glass and polished steel. Men and women in tailored suits moving with the purposeful stride of people who belonged. Elena smoothed her best blouse, a second-hand find from the Goodwill on Ashland, and felt every imperfection in the fabric announce itself beneath the fluorescent lights. The security guard studied her longer than anyone else. His eyes traveled from her scuffed flats to her thrift store handbag before landing on her face with the expression reserved for people who had clearly wandered into the wrong building. 52nd floor. Appointment with Mr. Callahan. The name worked like a key. He handed her a visitor badge without another question. She counted 47 seconds in the elevator, watching floor numbers tick past law firms and investment banks whose annual revenues exceeded the lifetime earnings of everyone on her block. She was ascending to another world, one where people like her were rarely welcome. The assistant who greeted her was impeccable, pressed dress, architectural hair, polished smile. She led Elena through a corridor of abstract paintings that cost more than her education, through double doors, and into a corner office that stole her breath. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped 2 walls, framing Chicago like a painting no gallery could hold. From up here, the city split cleanly in 2, the Loop and Gold Coast glittering to the north, towers of glass reflecting prosperity. To the south, the neighborhoods faded into smaller rooftops and vacant lots where Elena had learned to walk fast and never make eye contact. The distance between those 2 Chicagos looked small from the 52nd floor. She knew it was anything but. Ah, the talented waitress arrives. Dominic sat behind a desk of black oak, shirt sleeves rolled, jacket hung in the corner, calculated casualness. He gestured to the chair across from him and slid a thick envelope over the polished surface. 5,000, as promised. Elena's fingers hovered but didn't lift it. A woman of multiple talents is rare in my experience, he continued. I have associates in Mexico City, Guadalajara, Juarez, partners who prefer negotiations in their mother tongue. I need someone who can ensure nothing is lost in translation. I'm just a waitress trying to get through grad school and take care of my mother. Dominic's smile was warm. His eyes were not. We all have roles we play, Elena Vasquez. Yours as a struggling waitress, mine as a businessman with diverse interests spanning certain legal boundaries. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, slid one toward her. The question is whether we're brave enough to audition for better parts. Then came the terms. 3 times her current salary, flexible hours around her class schedule, and his voice dropping half a register, knowing exactly the weight it carried, complete coverage of her mother's medical expenses. Every prescription, every specialist, every treatment Rosa would ever need. Elena sipped the whiskey. It burned like swallowing a decision. What exactly would these translations involve? Nothing that should trouble your conscience excessively. Business discussions, cultural nuances that might be lost on me despite my rudimentary Spanish. His eyes narrowed just slightly. Think of it as freelance consulting with exceptional benefits. A knock interrupted them, his assistant with a 2:00 reminder. Dominic stood, buttoning his cuffs. First assignment. Dinner tonight with associates from Guadalajara. I'll send a car at 7. His tone made it clear refusal wasn't being offered. Elena looked at the envelope, then out through the glass. 52 stories below, the south side spread out small and distant. Somewhere down there, her mother was growing frailer by the day, consumed by a disease that didn't care about moral boundaries. Elena picked up the envelope. The black sedan arrived at exactly 7. Elena climbed in wearing a dress purchased 2 hours earlier with cash from Dominic's envelope, the first time blood money had ever touched her skin, though she suspected it wouldn't be the last. The fabric felt expensive against her body, foreign and borrowed, like wearing someone else's life. The car delivered her to Alinea, a restaurant she had only ever read about in magazines left behind by Moretti's customers, the kind of place where a single entree cost more than her weekly groceries. A hostess led her through the main dining room and past a velvet curtain into a private space where 5 men sat around a circular table set with crystal and white linen. 5 pairs of eyes turned to evaluate her simultaneously. The expressions ranged from open curiosity to something colder, the appraising look of men who categorized every person they encountered as either useful or disposable. Dominic rose from his chair as she entered. Gentlemen, my new cultural liaison. His hand found the small of her back, warm, proprietary, deliberate. Every instinct in Elena's body screamed to step away. She didn't. She understood. Even then, that showing discomfort in this room was a luxury she couldn't afford. The oldest of the five spoke first. Don Raphael, silver-haired, immaculately dressed, with eyes that held the particular coldness of a man who had long ago stopped distinguishing between business decisions and death sentences. He addressed Elena directly in Spanish, bypassing Dominic entirely. "So young to be involved in our world? Tell me, child, does she understand what happens to people who misinterpret sensitive conversations?" The threat hung in the air like smoke. Elena swallowed, feeling every man in the room watching for her reaction. She turned to Dominic and translated with precision the content of Don Raphael's words, the curiosity, the testing, while carefully excising the blade hidden inside them. Dominic received a question about her qualifications. What Don Raphael had actually delivered was a warning wrapped in a death threat disguised as small talk. First lesson learned: some things were better left unsaid. The negotiation that followed lasted 3 hours. Elena translated every exchange, but quickly discovered that translation was the smallest part of her job. Each sentence carried layers: surface, meaning, implied meaning, and the meaning that lived in the silence between words. When Don Raphael mentioned shipping delays, he meant something had gone wrong. When his younger associate referenced insurance costs, he was talking about bribes. When Dominic spoke of expanding market presence, Elena heard the territorial ambition underneath. She wasn't just converting Spanish to English. She was navigating a web of power, threat, and agenda where a single misplaced word could collapse a deal worth millions or worse. Dominic watched her throughout the evening, not the way he had watched her at Moretti's, with amusement and idle curiosity. This was different. Calculating, evaluating, the look of a man reassessing an asset whose value had just exceeded his initial estimate. By dessert, terms had been agreed upon. Handshakes exchanged the firm, brief grip of men who sealed agreements knowing that broken promises carried consequences no contract could enforce. Don Raphael offered Elena a nod before leaving, small, almost imperceptible. Acknowledgement from a man who didn't distribute respect easily. The ride back was quiet. Chicago's skyline slid past the tinted windows, the city's lights reflecting off the river in fractured patterns. Dominic sat beside her in silence for 6 blocks before speaking. "You did well tonight, better than anyone I've had before." His voice carried something Elena hadn't heard in it before, not warmth exactly, but the absence of performance. For a brief moment, Dominic Callahan sounded like a man offering a genuine compliment rather than a boss managing an employee. Elena stared at the passing streetlights and said nothing. She couldn't tell if what she'd just heard was praise or the sound of a noose tightening silk smooth and almost gentle as it settled around her throat. 3 weeks in, Elena built a system. Mornings belonged to Rosa hospital visits where she sat beside her mother's bed, holding hands thin enough to see the veins through, listening to doctors use words like managing and stabilizing that meant nothing was getting better, but at least nothing was getting worse. Afternoons belonged to the university when she could make it, slipping into lecture halls 20 minutes late, with coffee stains on her notebook and highlighter marks on readings. She'd finished at 3 a.m. between translation assignments. Evenings belonged to Dominic. The evenings were never the same place twice. Private dining rooms in restaurants whose names she'd only seen on magazine covers. Back booths in jazz clubs where the music was loud enough to cover conversations that could never be overheard. Hotel suites converted into temporary offices, where men spoke in low voices about shipments and territories and numbers that carried weight far beyond mathematics. "Your daughter is glowing these days," the nurse commented during Rosa's Tuesday treatment session, adjusting the IV drip with practiced hands. Whatever new job she found, it seems to be doing wonders for her stress levels. Elena smiled, the same practiced smile she'd perfected at Moretti's, the one that could pass for genuine under any lighting. If only they knew. The physical toll of her double life hid beneath expensive makeup Dominic insisted she wear. His translator was to appear polished and professional at all times, a reflection of the organization itself. Dark circles vanished under concealer that cost more than her old weekly tips. Exhaustion disappeared behind lipstick, the color of confidence she didn't feel. In Dominic's world, Elena observed a complex hierarchy that reminded her of wildlife documentaries she'd watched as a child, the ones narrated in calm British accents while predators circled prey. Dominance displays conducted through the quality of a man's watch, or the cut of his suit. Careful challenges issued through eye contact, held a second too long. And violence, always violence, lurking beneath civil conversations like a current beneath still water, ready to surface the moment someone miscalculated. She learned to read a room before a single word was spoken. Who sat closest to Dominic mattered. Who was offered a drink first mattered. Who Dominic addressed by first name versus surname that mattered most of all. A particularly tense meeting with Colombian suppliers tested everything she'd learned. The lead negotiator, a soft-spoken man with manicured nails and dead eyes, made demands that would have collapsed the deal if Elena had translated them literally. Instead, she softened edges, reframed ultimatums as suggestions, and navigated the conversation toward compromise, with adjustments so subtle neither side realized she was steering. The deal closed. Hands were shaken. The Colombians left satisfied. "You're a natural," Dominic told her afterward, loosening his tie in the back of the sedan. "Most people in your position would have cracked under that kind of pressure, or worse, tried to exploit what they knew for personal gain." Elena recognized the compliment for what it was, praise and warning braided together so tightly they were impossible to separate. "I'm just doing the job you're paying me for," she replied carefully, maintaining the professional distance that had so far kept her safe. But distance was becoming harder to maintain. Dominic began requesting her presence at events with no translation required. A fundraiser for a children's hospital, a gallery opening in River North, a private dinner with a city alderman where the only Spanish spoken was on the wine list. "My associates find you intriguing," he explained when she questioned the necessity. "Your presence projects a certain sophistication." She wanted to refuse. The word sat on her tongue like a stone, but refusal meant renegotiating a relationship where all the leverage belonged to one side. The charity gala at the Art Institute was where the line blurred beyond recognition. Elena watched Dominic work the room, charming socialites with self-deprecating humor, discussing policy with politicians who pretended not to know how he earned his money, commanding deference from men twice his age with nothing more than a handshake and a steady gaze. The same ease he used to intimidate rivals, he now deployed to seduce an entire ballroom. Then something unexpected. Dominic stopped before a painting, a Rufino Tamayo, bold reds and fractured forms, and began discussing brushwork with a museum curator. His voice changed. The performance fell away. For 30 unguarded seconds, Elena saw genuine passion on the face of a man she had believed incapable of anything uncontrolled. It was the most dangerous thing she had witnessed in 3 weeks of dangerous things. He wasn't always like this. Vivian Cross appeared at Elena's elbow like smoke champagne flute held at the practiced angle of a woman who had attended 1,000 galas and enjoyed none. The wife of Gregory Cross, one of Dominic's senior associates, watched him across the room with an expression Elena couldn't decode. Before his father was murdered, Dominic studied art history at Northwestern. Played piano, Chopin, mostly, though he'd never admit it now. Vivian's voice carried no emotion. Talents buried under necessity and vengeance. This city turns artists into monsters when it takes the wrong things from them. She disappeared into the crowd before Elena could respond, leaving behind information that lodged beneath Elena's ribs and refused to dislodge. The villain she had neatly categorized dangerous, criminal. Others suddenly contained dimensions she hadn't anticipated. The contradiction should have repulsed her. Instead, it complicated everything. Her world outside Dominic's orbit continued to shrink. Graduate school friends stopped calling. They couldn't reconcile the Elena who once wore the same 3 sweaters with the one who now carried designer bags and canceled plans with vague excuses. Her closest friend, Mariana, said it plainly during their last coffee. "You've changed." Not an accusation, something sadder. An observation from someone watching a person disappear. The isolation pushed Elena deeper into the one world where she understood the rules, however dangerous they were. One rainy Tuesday, Dominic surprised her, reviewing documents in his office. He noticed the textbook in her bag, Latin American literature. "How are your classes?" "Behind," she admitted. He set down his pen. Garcia Marquez understood that every man contains multitudes magic and mundane existing simultaneously. That's what makes Macondo feel true. It isn't fantasy. It's the most honest portrait of reality anyone ever wrote. The conversation lasted 3 hours. Rulfo's ghosts, Fuentes' labyrinths, Allende's women who carried storms. Dominic quoted passages from memory, the ease of someone who had once loved these words enough to memorize them. And somewhere in the fading afternoon light, he told her, "I was going to be a professor. Art history. Latin American muralists. Had the acceptance letter the same week my father was shot outside our house in Bridgeport." He paused. "Certain letters become irrelevant when other letters arrive. Perhaps in another life," he said finally, with a softness so unfamiliar it felt borrowed from someone else. His eyes held hers a beat too long, and Elena glimpsed the man Vivian had described. The pianist, the student, the person who existed before Chicago carved him into something else. Then his phone rang. The transformation was instantaneous. Softness drained from his face. Jaw reset. Eyes cooled. The man who had quoted Garcia Marquez vanished, replaced by the one who controlled the South Side. The crack behind the mask sealed shut as quickly as it had opened. That night, Elena lay awake in her new apartment, a one-bedroom in Pilsen that Dominic called a security necessity. Better neighborhood, solid locks, a doorman who reported to people she'd never met, nicer than anywhere she'd lived. It felt like a cage lined with good intentions. The truth she'd been circling for weeks finally caught her. The line separating her from this world was thinning not because Dominic was pulling her across, but because she was walking toward it on her own. Each glimpse of the buried human beneath the criminal eroded objections that had once felt like bedrock. The most dangerous part wasn't the violence or the money. It was that she was starting to understand him, and understanding was the first step toward forgiving things that should never be forgiven. The Spanish lessons began unexpectedly one evening in Dominic's penthouse. Elena had arrived for document review, but found him at the dining table with security reports pushed aside, struggling through a pronunciation guide with the frustrated intensity of a man unaccustomed to being bad at anything. "Teach me properly," he said without looking up. She discovered he was a demanding student. The same relentless focus he brought to negotiations, he now directed at rolling his R's and conjugating subjunctive verbs. When he couldn't master a sound after 20 minutes, his jaw tightened with frustration so genuine it almost made him look ordinary. "My old man said Spanish was beneath us," Dominic said during a break, pouring tequila. "A language for gardeners and dishwashers," his words. "Said any Callahan caught speaking it would get the belt." He turned the glass in his fingers. "But I always found it beautiful, especially when our housekeeper Maria would sing while she thought no one was listening. Old songs from Michoacan. I'd sit on the stairs and just listen." The lessons evolved into something neither had planned. Elena told him about her grandmother in Oaxaca, a woman who cured anything with herbs and prayer and stubbornness, who taught Elena Spanish through bedtime stories about trickster coyotes and weeping women. Dominic offered fragments in return. A childhood gilded from outside but governed by a father whose love and cruelty arrived in equal measure. During their third session, Elena reached for papers and dislodged a small sketchbook wedged beneath the files. She opened it before thinking and stopped. Chicago's skyline at dawn, pencil, remarkable precision. The Willis Tower catching first light, the river curving, shadows made beautiful by hands that understood how to see what others overlooked. Dominic snatched it back with a speed that betrayed something she'd never seen on his face. Embarrassment. Pure and unguarded. He shoved it into a drawer without a word, but the silence that followed was louder than any confession. 3 glasses of tequila later, the real confession came. "My mother was half Mexican." The words arrived quietly, as though they'd been waiting years for permission. Father married her for her family's connections south of the border, then spent their marriage erasing everything about her that wasn't useful. Forbade her language in our home, the music, the food, the holidays, a control tactic that broke her spirit years before cancer took her body. He stared at the amber liquid. "I was 14 when she died. The language he'd forbidden was the only part of her I had left, so I learned it in secret. Badly, from phrase books and a dishwasher named Julio who had more patience than any man I've ever known." The power dynamic shifted during these moments. In the penthouse, Dominic was the student and Elena the authority. The imbalance that defined their relationship inverted itself, creating an equality that made them both uncomfortable and neither wanted to end. "You remind me of someone," Dominic said as she gathered her things to leave. His voice had gone quiet younger, stripped of armor. "A girl from my old neighborhood who saw more in me than anyone else did, before circumstances forced different paths." He didn't say her name. Elena didn't ask. She left knowing 2 things with equal certainty: that Dominic Callahan contained genuine humanity beneath the empire built on suffering, and that this knowledge made her more trapped than any threat or paycheck ever could. The first time Elena witnessed real violence came on a Thursday night in a warehouse on the industrial edge of South Side. She had been told it was a routine translation. Nothing in Dominic's tone had suggested otherwise. The supplier was already on his knees when they arrived. A man in his 40s, face swollen, blood drawing a thin line from his hairline to his jaw. He knelt on bare concrete beneath fluorescent lights that hummed with indifference. Marcus Webb stood over him, brass knuckles gleaming on his right hand with the casual efficiency of a man performing routine maintenance. "Tell him his options in his mother tongue," Dominic instructed, his voice carrying the same calm he used to order dinner. "Make sure he understands exactly what failure costs." Elena's hands trembled as she relayed the message. Her voice held steadier than her body. The man's eyes found hers, locking on with desperate focus, pleading silently for mercy she had no authority to grant. Not here. Not in this room where brass knuckles caught fluorescent light like jewelry designed for a single terrible purpose. She finished translating. The man made his choice. They left. That night, Elena scrubbed her hands under water so hot it turned her skin raw. She scrubbed until the soap was gone, and she was just grinding her palms together as though friction could remove what soap couldn't. The salary that once seemed worth any flexibility now hung on her like wet concrete hardening, heavier with every minute. Dominic appeared at her door the following morning, unannounced. He studied the dark circles beneath her eyes, the rawness of her hands. "The first time is always the hardest," he said simply. No apology, no justification, just acknowledgement that what she'd witnessed deserved to leave a mark offered by the man responsible for the marking. Instead of business, he took her to a small bakery on 18th Street, owned by an elderly Mexican couple. The shop smelled like cinnamon and warm bread, and a childhood she thought she'd outgrown. Dominic greeted the owners in careful Spanish phrases she had taught him, delivered with humility that looked nothing like performance. The old woman beamed. Her husband clasped his hand with both of his. "Not everyone sees this side of you," Elena said as they walked back to his car, breath visible in the cold air. "Why show it to me?" Silence for half a block. Then, "Perhaps because you're the only person who speaks to me in two languages. The one I use for business and the one that reminds me of simpler times." The following week, Rosa collapsed. Elena's phone rang during a lecture her mother's neighbor, voice shaking. She arrived at Cook County to find Rosa gray-faced, doctors using words like acute flare and experimental protocol, and not covered by standard insurance. She didn't ask Dominic for help. She didn't have to. He appeared in the hospital corridor within the hour. Without a word, he stepped aside, made one call, and 20 minutes later a specialist from Mayo Clinic was being arranged. The best lupus program in the Midwest, activated by a man whose name opened doors that insurance cards could not. Gratitude and revulsion twisted together inside Elena's chest until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. From the far end of the corridor, Marcus Webb watched it all. Arms crossed, eyes fixed on the scene with an expression beyond suspicion, something harder, more deliberate. He didn't bother to disguise it anymore. Whatever patience Marcus had been exercising was running out. The specialist from Mayo Clinic arrived on a Tuesday. Elena sat in the corridor while he examined Rosa for over an hour, emerging with a cautious optimism that felt almost foreign in a building where most news traveled in shades of gray. "The new treatment protocol is responding well," he told Elena, reviewing charts on his tablet. "Her inflammatory markers have dropped significantly. Whatever strings you pulled to get this level of care, it's giving her a real fighting chance." Elena thanked him and waited until he disappeared around the corner before pressing her back against the wall and closing her eyes. Good news. The best news she'd received in months, and it twisted inside her like a knife, because every percentage point of improvement in Rosa's blood work had been purchased with a corresponding percentage of Elena's conscience. Her mother was getting better. The cost was everything Elena had once believed about herself. Rosa noticed it too, not the moral compromise, but its shadow. "You look tired, Mija," she said during Elena's next visit, reaching for her daughter's hand with fingers that were finally gaining strength. "This new job, it pays well, but does it treat you well?" Elena squeezed her mother's hand and changed the subject. Some translations were harder than others. In Dominic's world, the equilibrium was shifting. Marcus Webb's resentment had graduated from sidelong glances to open challenge. During strategy meetings, his eyes tracked Elena with undisguised hostility whenever her influence extended beyond translation, which was increasingly often. Dominic had begun consulting her on cultural nuances, negotiation, timing, even the reliability of certain associates based on verbal patterns she'd observed. "She knows too much about our operations for someone so new," Marcus said to Dominic after a meeting, his voice pitched low but not low enough. Elena was in the adjacent room, supposedly reviewing documents, close enough to catch every word through the thin wall. "Your fascination with this girl compromises years of careful work. She's been here 2 months, and she's already in rooms that took me 5 years to enter." Dominic's response was dismissive, a curt sentence about Marcus minding his own responsibilities. But Elena noticed changes in the days that followed. Security around her apartment increased without explanation. A driver appeared for every commute, not requested, not optional. A man she didn't recognize began occupying a car parked permanently across from her building's entrance. Protection or surveillance? Perhaps both. The ambiguity was itself a message that Dominic shared at least some of Marcus's concerns about how deeply she'd been woven into the fabric of his organization. Their relationship had evolved into something neither could name. Not romance, though. The air between them sometimes carried a charge that made Elena's breath catch in ways she refused to examine. Not merely professional, their conversations had wandered too far into personal territory to retreat behind that boundary. What connected them was something more complicated. A mutual dependency that both recognized and neither addressed. He needed her voice. She needed his resources. And somewhere in the space between need and need, something human had taken root, fragile, undefined, and dangerous to acknowledge. One afternoon, a courier arrived at Elena's apartment with a manila envelope marked urgent. Inside were documents requiring immediate translation for a meeting she had never been briefed on and couldn't find on any schedule she'd been given. Elena spread the papers across her kitchen table and felt the blood leave her face. Shipping manifests, routes, quantities, names of contacts on both sides of the border, written in plain text without the usual coded language Dominic's organization employed. Details more incriminating than anything she had ever been allowed to see, the kind of details that didn't just implicate an organization, but could dismantle one entirely. She stared at the documents and understood, with the clarity of someone stepping off a ledge, that whatever had just been placed in her hands was not what it appeared to be. Elena caught the courier before he reached the elevator. "Did Dom send these directly?" The man nodded, a quick, mechanical movement that carried no conviction. His eyes slid away from hers as he jabbed the elevator button twice, 3 times, and disappeared behind closing doors with the haste of someone eager to be absent when consequences arrived. Back in her apartment, Elena studied the documents again. Her linguistic training, the same training that made her valuable to Dominic, now screamed at her from every page. The language was wrong. Not the Spanish, which was fluent, but the structure. Dominic's organization communicated in layers of coded references that Elena had spent weeks learning to decode. These documents used none of them. They were written in plain, prosecutable text, the kind of clarity that existed only in evidence meant to be found. She called Dominic's office line. No answer. His cell. Voicemail. The driver assigned to her hadn't been informed of any meeting requiring urgent translation. Something was very wrong. That evening, Elena drove herself to Willis Tower. The 52nd floor was mostly dark. Dominic's assistant had left for the day. The outer offices empty, but light bled from beneath the door of the conference room adjacent to Dominic's office, and through it came a voice she recognized instantly. Marcus Webb, speaking rapidly into a phone, his usual measured tone replaced by something urgent and exposed. Elena pressed herself against the wall and listened. Once she translates those documents, her fingerprints will be all over the evidence when it reaches the federal prosecutor. The girl becomes the conduit. She handled everything. She had access. She made the connections. Callahan's organization gets dismantled, and I walk out clean with immunity already in writing. Ice water. That was what it felt like, ice water replacing the blood in her veins, flooding her chest, freezing her lungs mid-breath. Marcus wasn't just undermining her position. He was engineering her destruction, framing her as the operational link between Dominic's criminal enterprise and federal evidence, transforming her from translator into scapegoat with a single stack of carefully constructed documents. Elena's hands shook as she processed the architecture of the betrayal. Marcus hadn't just turned against Dominic. He was working with federal authorities, had been, perhaps for months, and had designed a trap elegant enough to remove Elena from the organization, while simultaneously delivering Dominic to prosecutors. 2 threats eliminated with 1 maneuver. She slipped into Dominic's office on silent feet. The room was dark, the city glittering beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass like a witness that wouldn't testify. Elena pulled out her phone and photographed the appointment calendar on his desk, confirming what she already suspected. No meeting was scheduled. No translation had been requested. Dominic knew nothing about the documents that now sat in her apartment with her fingerprints on every page. The betrayal targeted both of them. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Dr. Catherine Shaw, her academic advisor. Elena almost didn't answer, but instinct overrode caution. "Elena, I need to ask you something directly." Dr. Shaw's voice was careful, measured. "The scholarship board has flagged your file. They're questioning a significant improvement in your financial situation. New apartment, reduced class attendance, unexplained absences. They've requested a review. I wanted to warn you before the formal letter arrives." Elena closed her eyes. Marcus's plan wasn't limited to the criminal world. He was dismantling every pillar of her life, the organization, the university, her scholarship, leaving no refuge standing if his trap succeeded. A systematic demolition executed with the patience of a man who had spent 15 years learning how power structures could be collapsed from within. She ended the call and stood alone in Dominic's dark office, holding a phone full of photographs that proved a conspiracy designed to destroy 2 people simultaneously. The documents in her apartment, Marcus's phone call, the scholarship review. Each piece clicked into place with the terrible precision of a lock being sealed from the outside. Footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate, approaching. The office door opened. Light from the corridor cut across the floor like a blade. Dominic stood in the doorway, suit jacket removed. Shirt collar loosened the appearance of a man who had returned for something forgotten. His eyes found Elena in the darkness of his own office, and every trace of warmth she had ever seen in them vanished. "Why are you in my office, Elena?" Elena had 3 seconds to decide. Lie and hope Dominic believed whatever explanation she could construct in the dark, or tell the truth and place her survival entirely in the hands of a man she had watched order violence without blinking. She chose the truth, not because it was noble, but because she had run out of alternatives. "Marcus is setting me up." The words came fast, tumbling over each other like passengers fleeing a wreck. "He sent documents to my apartment, shipping manifests with enough detail to bring down your entire operation. Plain text, no codes, nothing encrypted, designed to look like I was the one compiling evidence. I came here to check your calendar because I knew you hadn't authorized the translation. And while I was here, I heard him in the conference room on the phone, telling someone that once my fingerprints were on those documents, the federal prosecutor would have everything needed to take you down and frame me as the conduit." Dominic didn't move. His eyes narrowed to slits, jaw muscles working beneath the skin. The silence that followed was the most dangerous kind, the silence of a man deciding whether to believe or destroy. "Show me," he said. Elena handed him her phone, the photographs of his empty calendar, the screen recording she'd instinctively started when Marcus's voice first bled through the wall. Dominic scrolled through the evidence with the focused precision of a man reading a battlefield. His expression shifted in stages. Skepticism first, then recognition, then something that made Elena step back involuntarily. Cold fury, not the explosive kind that burns hot and fades, the geological kind, pressure building beneath the surface, patient and absolute, the kind that reshapes landscapes when it finally moves. He pulled up his internal security system on the office computer. Surveillance footage from the past month materialized in split-screen windows, timestamps, locations, faces. Marcus meeting men Dominic didn't recognize in a parking garage on West Cermak. Marcus passing an envelope to a woman in a federal building lobby. Marcus at a restaurant in Lincoln Park, with 2 members of the Vargas organization, Dominic's primary competitors, on the south side. The betrayal wasn't a sudden fracture. It was an excavation, months of careful tunneling beneath the foundation, weakening every load-bearing wall until the structure was ready to collapse at the precise moment Marcus chose to pull the trigger. "He's not just framing me," Elena said quietly. "He's been working with the FBI and feeding information to your rivals simultaneously. He's dismantling you from every direction." Dominic stared at the surveillance footage. His face revealed nothing, a mask so complete it was more frightening than any expression could have been. When he finally spoke, his voice was level. "You could have taken those documents straight to the authorities, traded everything you know about my organization for immunity, saved yourself and walked away clean." He turned from the screen to face her. "Why warn me instead?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither was prepared to articulate. Elena thought of Rosa's treatment, of the bakery on 18th Street, of Chopin and Garcia Marquez, and a sketchbook hidden in a drawer. She thought of brass knuckles under fluorescent lights, and a man bleeding on concrete, and the sound her hands made when she scrubbed them raw. "Because despite everything," she said, "I believe you would have done the same for me." The silence lasted long enough for Elena to hear her own heartbeat. Dominic studied her face with an intensity that felt surgical, searching for deception in the movement of her eyes, the tension of her jaw, the micro-expressions that liars couldn't control. Whatever he was looking for, he didn't find it. He turned back to the surveillance feeds. Marcus appeared in frame after frame, a 15-year lieutenant methodically disassembling the empire he had helped build, motivated by jealousy or greed or some corrosive combination of both that had been eating through his loyalty long before Elena ever set foot in Moretti's restaurant. Dominic closed the laptop, stood, buttoned his cuffs with mechanical precision. His face was stone. His voice didn't waver by a single frequency. "Marcus has 24 hours left of thinking he's clever." It was the steadiness that terrified her. Not anger. Anger could be reasoned with, redirected, survived. This was something colder. The calm of a man who had already made a decision and was now simply organizing the logistics of its execution. Dominic moved with terrifying efficiency. Within hours of their conversation, calls were made from burner phones to numbers Elena would never know. 3 men faces she recognized from the innermost circle. Men who had been with Dominic since before the Empire had a name arrived at the penthouse separately, at staggered intervals, through different entrances. No one spoke above a whisper. No one asked unnecessary questions. Elena sat in the corner and watched the machinery of retribution assemble itself with the quiet precision of a clock being wound. "Continue your normal routine," Dominic told her, his voice stripped of every trace of warmth she had grown accustomed to hearing during their Spanish lessons and literary conversations. The man giving orders now was pure operation, no poetry, no vulnerability, no cracks in the facade. Go to class, visit your mother, and act as though you're translating those documents exactly as Marcus intended. Act as though you're helping him destroy you, Elena said, making sure she understood the instruction correctly. Act as though you're helping him destroy us, Dominic corrected. The distinction was deliberate, so Elena performed. Each morning she sat at her kitchen table with Marcus's fabricated documents spread before her, pen in hand, making notes in the margins as though converting Spanish to English, rather than playing a role in a counter-operation designed to catch a traitor in the act. Each page she pretended to translate tightened the noose around a man who had underestimated the connection between a waitress and the boss he'd served for 15 years. She reported her progress through the channels Marcus had established a secondary phone number, an encrypted messaging app feeding him confirmation that the trap was working exactly as he'd planned. On the other end of those messages, Marcus believed he was watching the final pieces of his scheme fall into place. He didn't know that every word Elena sent was drafted in Dominic's office, calibrated to maintain the illusion long enough for Dominic's people to document every thread of Marcus's betrayal. But Elena was caught between two machines, now Dominic's counter-trap and her own survival instinct, and she trusted neither completely. On the second night, after Dominic's driver dropped her home and the apartment fell silent, she made a decision that would change everything. She photographed select pages from the documents. Not all of them, just enough. Names, routes, dates. Information that could serve as insurance if Dominic's protection ever evaporated, or as a bargaining chip if federal authorities came knocking at her door instead of Marcus's. She encrypted the files and stored them on a cloud account tied to an email address no one in Dominic's world knew existed. Personal insurance. Potential escape route, packed into one desperate act committed at 2 a.m. with trembling hands and the taste of betrayal her own, this time bitter on her tongue. 3 days of suffocating tension followed. Elena maintained her routine with mechanical precision. Morning hospital visits where Rosa's improving health felt like a rebuke. Afternoon lectures where post-colonial theory seemed absurdly distant from the post-colonial reality she was living. Evening translation performances for an audience of one traitor who believed he was winning. Each second of each day, she knew her life balanced on a wire stretched between two men, one who wanted to destroy her and one who might destroy her if he ever learned about the photographs hidden in her cloud account. On the third evening, Elena left the university library at 9 o'clock. The campus was quiet. Exam period had thinned the usual crowds to scattered clusters of students bent over laptops in the warm glow of study rooms. The parking lot beyond the library was nearly empty, her car sitting alone under a light that flickered with the indecisive rhythm of a bulb approaching death. She was halfway across the asphalt when a black SUV cut across 2 lanes and stopped directly in her path. Engine running, headlights pinning her in place like a specimen under glass. The rear door opened. Marcus Webb stepped out, expensive overcoat slightly bulging on the left side, a shape Elena had learned to recognize months ago. The first night Dominic walked into Moretti's. "Get in the car." Elena sat in the back of the SUV with her hands folded in her lap and her pulse hammering so loud she was certain Marcus could hear it. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them stretched tight as piano wire, the kind that cuts before it snaps. The city thinned as they drove south, buildings giving way to vacant lots, then to the industrial graveyard where Chicago stored the bones of its manufacturing past. Rusted fences, crumbling loading docks, streetlights that had stopped working years ago, and no one had bothered to fix because no one who mattered came here anymore. The SUV stopped in front of a warehouse whose windows had been dark so long they'd forgotten what light looked like. Marcus stepped out first, then opened Elena's door with the exaggerated courtesy of a man who had already decided how this evening would end. "Dom's judgment has been compromised since you showed up," Marcus said as he walked her through the entrance, his voice echoing off concrete walls. "Sentiment is weakness in our business, something I tried to teach him for 15 years. 15 years of building something, and he lets a waitress with a Spanish accent dismantle it because she reminds him of his dead mother." The warehouse interior was a cathedral of abandonment. Empty shipping containers lined the walls like hollow teeth. Forgotten machinery hulked in shadows, shapes too large, and still to be anything but dead. Their footsteps on bare concrete were the only sound, each one confirming what Elena already knew. Complete isolation. No witnesses. No reason to keep her alive after getting what he wanted. Marcus stopped in a space cleared between containers. He turned to face her, and the pretense of civility dropped like a coat he no longer needed. "The documents you translated. Where are the originals?" The gun appeared from beneath his overcoat, matte black, steady in hands that had clearly held one before. He pressed it against Elena's ribs with enough pressure to feel the barrel's cold circle through her blouse. I know you're too smart to have left yourself unprotected. Dom thinks he destroyed all evidence, but you're a survivor. You kept copies. Where? Elena opened her mouth to answer, but the answer never came. The warehouse door exploded inward with a sound like the world breaking. Metal screamed against metal as Dominic entered, flanked by 2 armed men, their weapons raised and their movements carrying the rehearsed efficiency of people who had done this before. Dominic's face was terrifyingly calm. 15 years of loyalty means nothing when betrayal follows, he said, advancing slowly despite the gun still pressed against Elena's side. Did you think I wouldn't verify her story, Marcus? That I wouldn't check the accounts you've been skimming for years? The embezzlement alone would have been enough. But the meetings with Vargas, the calls to the FBI, you weren't just betraying me. You were auctioning me. The revelation of deeper treachery registered on Marcus's face, a flash of shock that broke through his composure for a single, critical second. He hadn't known about the surveillance footage. He hadn't known Dominic had been watching him watch them. That second was enough. Elena drove her elbow into Marcus's solar plexus, with every ounce of desperate strength her body contained. He doubled forward, the gun shifting away from her ribs, and she threw herself sideways, diving behind a shipping container as the first shot rang out. Then everything became gunfire. Bullets ricocheted off metal surfaces with sharp, singing impacts that turned the warehouse into an echo chamber of violence. Elena pressed herself flat against the concrete floor and crawled. Her literature studies felt absurdly distant Borges's labyrinths, replaced by a real one made of rusted steel, where every wrong turn ended not in metaphor but in bullets. Her hand found something on the ground, a fallen guard's phone, cracked screen still glowing. With shaking fingers, she sent her location to the only contact outside Dominic's world she could think of, Dr. Catherine Shaw, who had once mentioned counterterrorism consultation work during office hours, a detail Elena had filed away without knowing it would someday mean survival. Marcus's backup arrived more men than Dominic had anticipated, pouring through a side entrance and forcing his loyalists into defensive positions. The choreography of violence escalated with sickening speed. A spray of bullets shattered the windows above. Glass rained down in a cascade that sliced Elena's cheek as she army-crawled toward a maintenance door she'd spotted in the far wall. A stray round grazed her left arm, a line of hot, bright pain that blazed across her skin and turned her sleeve dark and wet. The girl who had once panicked over missed essay deadlines was now dragging herself through crossfire with blood running between her fingers and concrete scraping her palms raw. She reached the door, pushed through. Night air hit her face like cold water, shocking, clarifying, real. She stumbled into the alley behind the warehouse, vision tilting as blood loss and adrenaline fought for control of her body, tires screaming on asphalt. A black car she recognized skidded to a halt 3 feet from where she stood swaying. Dominic emerged from the driver's seat, shirt torn, blood on his collar that might or might not have been his own, face carved from something harder than stone. "It's over," he said, reaching for her injured arm with a gentleness that contradicted everything about the scene behind them. Marcus won't betray anyone again. The drive to Dominic's private doctor passed in fragments, streetlights bleeding into each other, the leather seat growing warm beneath her. Dominic's profile in the dashboard glow saying nothing. The doctor was waiting when they arrived. Efficient, unsurprised, asking no questions that extended beyond the medical. 3 fractured ribs, mild concussion, significant blood loss, he reported to Dominic while cleaning the wound on Elena's arm. She needs complete rest, 2 weeks minimum. No stress, no work, nothing strenuous. Dominic nodded once. His composure had returned fully, the controlled exterior restored, as though the past hour had been something that happened to someone else. Only his eyes betrayed him. They drifted toward Elena twice, during the examination, brief glances, quickly corrected, carrying a concern that had nothing to do with professional interest in his translator's recovery, and everything to do with something neither of them was ready to name. Elena woke to the sound of water, not the dripping faucet of her old studio, or the hospital machinery that had soundtracked her mother's treatment, but the gentle, rhythmic lapping of Lake Michigan against a wooden dock. She lay still for a moment, cataloging the unfamiliar. Cedar ceiling, wool blanket that smelled like pine, windows framing a gray expanse of water that stretched to the horizon like a second sky. The lake house belonged to a distant relative, according to Dominic. Elena didn't ask which kind of relative, the blood kind or the business kind. In his world, the distinction rarely mattered. What mattered was that the property existed on no document connected to the Callahan name, accessible only by a private road that wound through dense forest before revealing itself on a bluff overlooking the lake. Isolation meant safety. It also meant that Dominic was the only other person within miles. The first 2 days passed in a haze of painkillers and fractured sleep. Elena's body announced its damage in waves, ribs screaming when she breathed too deeply. The arm wound throbbing beneath fresh bandages. Headaches that arrived without warning and departed on their own schedule. She drifted in and out of consciousness while the lake kept its patient rhythm outside the window. On the third morning, she woke to find a breakfast tray on the nightstand. Toast, scrambled eggs, tea with honey assembled with a domestic care that looked foreign on a man whose hands had held a gun 12 hours before holding a spatula. Dominic sat in the chair by the window, reading something on his phone, looking like a man who hadn't slept but would never admit it. Police found Marcus's body, he said without looking up. His voice carried the same casual register he used for weather reports and wine orders. Official report says gang violence. Technically accurate, if not complete. Elena reached for the tea. Her hand trembled not from the concussion, but from the crystallizing reality of what her life had become. She was a witness to murder, a recipient of money earned through violence and exploitation, dependent on a criminal's protection for her safety, her mother's health, her continued freedom. Every line she had drawn since childhood, every boundary her grandmother had taught her to defend, had been crossed so gradually that she hadn't felt the ground change beneath her feet until there was no ground left to return. "Is a debtor. My organization is vulnerable," Dominic said, setting down his phone with the deliberate control of a man handling something fragile. It was the first time Elena had heard him admit weakness, without wrapping it in deflection. Marcus's betrayal created opportunities. Every rival in the city knows blood is in the water. They're circling. The damage extended beyond reputation. Over the following days, news arrived in fragments, each one worse than the last. The primary distribution warehouse on the west side had been seized by federal agents acting on an anonymous tip. 2 mid-level associates had been arrested at the border. A network of accounts in the Cayman Islands had been frozen pending investigation. The mask Dominic wore, the one that had held through 15 years of building an empire, through the betrayal of his closest lieutenant, through a gunfight in an abandoned warehouse, finally cracked. Not dramatically, not with rage or despair, just a fissure in the composure, visible only to someone who had learned to read him the way Elena had. "Someone is systematically dismantling everything I built over 20 years, he said one evening, pacing the cabin's living room while making calls in rapid succession. His voice remained controlled, but his movements carried an energy Elena had never seen, the restlessness of a man watching the walls close in and running out of rooms to retreat to. "Your legitimate businesses," Elena said carefully. "The imports, the logistics company, the restaurants, they're still untouched. Maybe it's time to consider transitioning completely. Let the criminal side go before it drags everything down." Dominic's laugh held no humor. "My legitimate businesses exist to launder money from the others, Elena. Without the criminal enterprises, the clean ones collapse within 6 months. The logistics company, the foundation that pays for your mother's treatment, the accounts that keep this roof over our heads." He stopped pacing and faced her. "Everything is connected. Pull one thread and the whole thing unravels, including the parts that keep the people I care about alive." The toxic truth settled between them like sediment in still water. Their mutual dependency, his need for her voice, her need for his resources, the unnamed thing growing in the space between, had evolved from arrangement to lifestyle to trap. Neither could walk away without destroying the other, and both knew it, and neither said it aloud, because naming a cage doesn't open its door. They sat in silence as the lake darkened outside. 2 people bound together by circumstances that had outgrown every category either could assign not love, not business, not friendship, but something built from pieces of all 3, held together by necessity and the quiet understanding that they had each seen the other's true face and chosen not to look away. The sound of tires on gravel shattered the stillness. Dominic was on his feet instantly, hand reaching for the weapon that now lived on the table beside him like a permanent guest. Elena moved to the window and watched a silver sedan emerge from the tree line, trailing dust. Vivian Cross stepped out of the driver's seat, alone. No husband, no entourage, no warning. Her face carried the expression of a woman delivering news that would change the architecture of every life it touched. "Gregory has been arrested," she said before she'd fully crossed the threshold. "They're coming for you next, Dominic." Vivian closed the lake house door behind her and, without ceremony, reached up and removed her hair. The elegant blonde waves that Elena had always admired at galas and dinners lifted away in one piece, an expensive wig revealing closely cropped dark hair beneath. Then the colored contacts, extracted with practiced fingers and placed in a case she carried in her jacket pocket. The woman who emerged from beneath the disguise looked 5 years younger and entirely different, sharper, harder, stripped of the decorative softness that had defined Vivian Cross as a socialite wife. "My name isn't Vivian," she said, settling into a chair with the posture of someone accustomed to debriefings. My marriage to Gregory was an assignment. 7 years of domestic cover monitoring financial networks connected to organized crime in the Midwest. She glanced at Dominic. Your organization included, though you were never the primary target. CIA, Dominic said. Not a question. Former. Reassigned to domestic monitoring after budget cuts made overseas operations less attractive than homegrown investigations. She opened a leather briefcase and spread documents across the coffee table with the efficiency of someone who had presented evidence in rooms far more hostile than this one. Gregory's arrest is the beginning, not the end. The federal prosecutor building the case against your organization has enough to indict within weeks, but I have something that changes the math. The documents told a story far larger than Dominic's Southside empire. Names of politicians who had accepted bribes dwarfing anything in Dominic's ledgers. Corporate executives whose fraud made his operations look like corner store theft. International supply chains connecting cartels to legitimate businesses whose logos appeared on billboards and stock exchanges. The federal government wants headlines, Vivian explained. Your arrest gives them a local news cycle. These names give them a national one. I'm proposing a trade-limited immunity for you in exchange for cooperation on the international suppliers. You provide testimony on the routes and contacts. They get the bigger fish. Your core domestic assets remain untouched. Dominic studied the documents with the expression of a man recalculating every assumption he'd ever made. Elena watched from across the room and felt the ground shift beneath them both, the realization that they had been pieces in a game whose board extended far beyond anything either had imagined. Dominic's empire, Marcus's betrayal, Elena's recruitment, all of it nested inside something larger, orchestrated by players whose names they'd never known. Why are you helping him? Elena asked Vivian during a moment alone in the kitchen, while Dominic made calls from the bedroom. Your husband is already in custody. Helping Dominic seems counterproductive to your own position. Vivian's smile held layers. Elena couldn't fully read. Gregory was never the real power in our marriage. He was the cover. I was the architecture. She poured herself water from the tap with the ease of a woman who had occupied far less comfortable kitchens. Women in this world aren't merely decorative accessories, Elena. We're often the hidden architects behind the structures men think they built. You should know that better than most, considering how much of Dominic's recent survival depends on a waitress who speaks 2 languages. The negotiation consumed 3 days. Vivian served as mediator between Dominic's world and federal contacts she maintained through channels Elena didn't ask about. Terms were drafted, revised, argued over, and revised again. Limited immunity in exchange for information about international suppliers. Dominic's testimony on routes and contacts that would satisfy the prosecution while preserving his domestic operations. Elena's involvement classified as coerced cooperation, a legal shield Vivian insisted upon with a firmness that surprised everyone except Elena, who was beginning to understand that Vivian did nothing without calculation. By the 3rd evening, the framework was nearly complete. One more call to confirm terms, one more signature, one more day, and the architecture of their survival would be finished. They never got that day. The sound came first distant, then rapidly closer. The rhythmic thudding of helicopter blades cutting through the night air above the tree line, then light blinding, white, pouring through every window of the lake house like a searchlight from God, turning the interior stark and shadowless. Vivian reached the window first. Her face, usually unreadable, registered something Elena had never seen on it before. Fear. They bypassed my channels, she said quietly. Someone fed them fresh intelligence. Someone who knew exactly where to find us. FBI. Already here. The negotiated surrender hadn't been fast enough, or someone had ensured it wouldn't be. Elena's stomach dropped as a thought struck her with sickening clarity. The files she had secretly copied. The cloud account. Her insurance policy. If anyone had accessed that account, if any digital trace had led investigators to those documents, then the fresh intelligence that brought the FBI to this lake house hadn't come from Marcus's ghost or Vivian's compromised channels. It had come from her. The front door caved inward. FBI. On the ground. Now. Dominic didn't freeze. He moved, grabbing Elena's wrist with one hand and a weapon with the other, pulling her toward the bedroom as flashlight beams sliced through the lake house like white blades. Vivian was already gone, vanished through a window or a contingency Elena hadn't seen, because women like Vivian always had exits that other people didn't know about. In the bedroom, Dominic shoved the heavy wardrobe aside with a strength that adrenaline makes ordinary. Behind it, a door that wasn't a door, a panel flush with the wall, opening onto a narrow concrete passage that smelled like earth and disuse. The tunnel of a man who had always known this night might come. Move, he said, pushing Elena through first. The passage was barely wide enough for shoulders, the ceiling low enough to scrape her scalp. She ran crouched, one hand on the damp wall, the other held in Dominic's grip so tight her fingers went numb. They emerged into the forest 50 yards behind the lake house. Through the trees, Elena could see the strobing blue and red of federal vehicles, the helicopter spotlight sweeping the property in slow arcs, agents moving through the front entrance of a building they no longer occupied. Dominic pulled her deeper into the woods, branches catching her clothes and skin. His breath came hard. His grip never loosened. "Someone betrayed us again," he said through clenched teeth, each word bitten off like something that tasted wrong. "Whoever is dismantling my organization knew exactly where to find us. Vivian's channels were supposed to be secure." Guilt hit Elena like a physical blow, a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with her healing ribs. The copied documents, the cloud account, her desperate 2 a.m. insurance policy, created in the terrified logic of a woman who trusted no one completely. If the FBI had found those files, if any digital fingerprint had traced back to that account, then the fresh intelligence that brought helicopters to this lake house hadn't come from Vivian's compromised contacts or Marcus's posthumous revenge. It had come from Elena herself. The realization tore through her as her feet kept moving. She had done this. Her act of self-preservation, the one secret she'd kept from the man whose hand now gripped hers while they fled through darkness, had accelerated the very collapse they were running from. Every step through the forest carried the weight of that knowledge, heavier than the pain in her ribs, sharper than the branches clawing her face. She couldn't tell him, not now, perhaps not ever. They drove through the night in a car Dominic retrieved from a storage facility whose existence Elena hadn't known about. One of many contingencies layered into an empire built by a man who planned for betrayal the way other people planned for weather. The highways blurred into surface streets, then into neighborhoods Elena recognized with growing unease. South Side, her South Side. Dominic parked behind a building she knew before he turned off the engine. Moretti's, dark, closed for renovation. A sign in the window announced reopening in 3 weeks. But Dominic walked to the service entrance with the certainty of a man who had memorized this building's secrets long before Elena had ever tied on an apron inside it. The door opened with a key she didn't know he possessed. Inside, the restaurant was stripped to its bones. Tables stacked against walls, chairs upended, the floor bare where carpet had been pulled up, exposing the original tile beneath. It smelled like dust and paint and the ghost of garlic from a kitchen that had fed this neighborhood for decades. The place where everything began. Dominic stood in the empty dining room, scanning exits and sightlines with the automatic assessment of a man who never entered a room without planning how to leave it. Then his shoulders dropped an inch, maybe less, and for the first time since Elena had known him, he looked tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. "We need to separate," he said. "They want me, not you. Walk away now. Claim Stockholm Syndrome. Claim coercion. It's close enough to true that any lawyer could sell it. Your mother's care continues through offshore accounts Marcus never knew about. You disappear into your old life and pretend the last few months were a nightmare you woke up from." He meant it. Elena could hear it in his voice, not strategy, not manipulation, but the raw arithmetic of a man trying to subtract himself from the equation, before the equation killed someone he wasn't willing to lose. Elena looked at him. The steel-gray eyes that had laughed at her across a restaurant table months ago, arrogant, amused, untouchable, were different now. Exhaustion lived in them, and something else. Something she had never seen break the surface before. Fear. Not for himself. For her. "Running solves nothing," Elena said. Her voice was steady in a way her hands were not. "Whatever happens next, we face it together. Not because I approve of what you've done, but because I understand why you did it." The headlights found them at midnight. White beams cut through Moretti's front windows, sweeping across the empty dining room like searchlights hunting for something that had already stopped running. Then the voices amplified through speakers, distorted by authority into something barely human. "This is the FBI. The building is surrounded. Come out with your hands visible." Blue and red strobed against the bare walls, painting the stripped restaurant in colors that pulsed like a heartbeat. Through the window, Elena counted vehicles 6, 8, more arriving. Tactical units taking positions behind SUVs with the rehearsed geometry of men who had practiced this exact scenario dozens of times. Beyond them, media vans were already assembling, satellite dishes rising like mechanical flowers, eager to broadcast the fall of a notorious criminal figure. The narrative was already being written. Cameras would capture what cameras always captured, the simple version. Villain apprehended, innocent rescued. A clean story with clean lines that would erase every moral ambiguity, every complicated truth, every moment of genuine human connection that had led two people to this empty restaurant at midnight. Inside, Dominic and Elena sat at a table. Not just any table, the corner table where his entourage had snickered months ago, while a waitress clutched her notepad, and a man in a charcoal suit laughed about $5,000. The same tiles beneath their feet, the same window to their left, the same distance between two chairs that had once separated a Mafia boss from a struggling waitress, and now separated two people whose story had grown too complicated for the headlines already being composed outside. Dominic laughed. It came without warning, sudden, genuine, startling in the silence. He shook his head, pressing his fingers against his eyes like a man confronting something so absurd it could only be met with surrender. "I never paid you that $5,000 from our first bet," he said. "All of this, everything that's happened, and I never actually paid the debt that started it." Elena stared at him. Then she laughed too, not because it was funny, but because the alternative was something neither of them could afford. "You earned it fair and square with your Spanish," Dominic continued, his voice carrying the ghost of the arrogant smile he'd worn that first night. "I should have just paid the money and let you go back to your shift. Would have been cheaper for both of us." Elena reached across the table and took his hand. Not romantically, not desperately, with the quiet deliberateness of someone acknowledging a journey that defied every simple word available to describe it, a gesture that contained the bakery on 18th Street and the warehouse floor, and Garcia Marquez and brass knuckles, and Chopin and blood on concrete and a sketchbook hidden in a drawer. "The money was never what changed my life," she said. "It was discovering that people are rarely what they first appear to be." Dominic's fingers tightened around hers. Outside, a negotiator's voice repeated its demands. Elena's eyes drifted to the security monitor behind the bar, still functioning, still recording, its small screen showing the federal perimeter from 4 angles. She scanned the faces of the commanders directing operations and felt her breath stop. Dr. Catherine Shaw, her literature professor, her academic advisor, the woman who had graded her papers on magical realism and once mentioned counterterrorism work during office hours as though it were a minor hobby. She stood among the federal commanders in body armor and credential badges, directing agents with an authority that had nothing to do with post-colonial theory. The two worlds Elena had fought to keep separate, the student and the translator, the academic and the criminal, collapsed into a single frame on a security monitor in a closed restaurant on Chicago's South Side. Her mentor and her secret, converging at the same door. "They're being careful," Dominic observed, watching the same screen with professional detachment. "Someone told them about my background. They're treating this like a barricade situation." He almost sounded respectful. The front doors exploded inward. Tactical teams poured through in a wave of Kevlar and shouted commands. Weapons trained on 2 people sitting at a table holding hands. The absurdity of the image, a man in a blood-stained shirt and a woman with bandaged ribs, surrounded by stacked chairs in an empty Italian restaurant, seemed to register on some of the agents' faces before training overrode surprise. Dominic released Elena's hand. He rose slowly from his chair, the way a man stands when he wants every person holding a weapon to understand that no sudden movements will follow. His hands came up, palms open, fingers spread. The gesture of surrender looked foreign on him, like a word borrowed from a language he had never studied. A man built to command, performing the single act his entire life had been designed to avoid. "Dominic Callahan, you're under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy, and violations of federal statutes." The charges continued as handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a metallic finality that Elena felt in her own bones. She watched from the table, heart constricting, eyes burning, knowing this moment had always been inevitable, and finding that knowledge provided no comfort at all. In his final free act, Dominic turned to face her. The tactical team tensed, hands tightening on weapons, but he made no move except to speak. And when he spoke, it was in Spanish, perfect, fluid, carrying the accent she had taught him during evenings in his penthouse when he was just a man struggling with pronunciation, and she was just a woman sharing her grandmother's language. "Tell them everything, the good and the bad. My redemption was always impossible. But perhaps through your truth, something better emerges from what we built together." They led him through the door. The cameras outside captured exactly what cameras were designed to capture: a criminal in handcuffs, agents in formation, the machinery of justice performing its public ritual. None of them recorded what had happened inside. None of them could. 6 months later, the federal courthouse was designed to make people feel small, marble floors echoing every footstep into judgment, ceilings high enough to remind anyone beneath them that the institution was larger than any individual it processed. Elena sat with her hands clasped tight, the same white-knuckled gesture from the night. A man in a charcoal suit laughed at her across a restaurant table. Her immunity deal had been secured through Vivian's channels, and the documents she'd preserved, the same documents whose digital copies had led the FBI to the lake house. The irony cut both ways. The act that accelerated Dominic's capture had also guaranteed her freedom. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do." Dominic watched from the defendant's table in a suit that fit less perfectly than anything she'd seen him wear. His expression was unreadable to everyone in the courtroom except Elena. The language they shared had evolved beyond Spanish or English into something that lived in silence. What he communicated was simple. Tell the truth. All of it. The prosecution wanted a monster. Their questions were designed to build one warehouse violence, criminal enterprises, threats and intimidation painted in black and white. The defense wanted a victim, Elena, as coerced participant. Her testimony, the product of Stockholm Syndrome, her words discountable by the very suffering that made them credible. Elena gave them neither. The defendant showed capacity for both extraordinary cruelty and unexpected compassion, she said after hours of questioning. His organization destroyed lives through illegal activities. I witnessed that destruction. I participated in it, and I will carry that complicity for the rest of my life. She paused. Yet this same organization provided medical care to my mother when every legitimate system had failed her. The man who ordered violence on warehouse floors also spoke Spanish to an elderly couple in a bakery with a gentleness I never saw him show anyone else. She looked at Dominic. He looked back. He is not the monster the prosecution describes. He is not the victim the defense implies. He is a flawed human being who built a system that destroyed others and found himself trapped inside it, unable to dismantle it without destroying the people he had, against all expectation, come to protect. The jury deliberated 3 days. The verdict acknowledged complexity that headlines could not. 15 years. Not the life sentence the prosecution demanded. Not the reduced charge the defense sought. Punishment tempered with the possibility of redemption shaped by the testimony of the waitress he'd once mocked with a $5,000 bet. As they led him from the courtroom, Dominic turned a slight rotation, a glance over the chain between his wrists. His eyes found Elena's across the room, full of strangers and lawyers and cameras. No words, no Spanish, no English. Just the silent language of two people who had seen each other completely and chosen not to look away. Then he was through the door. Moretti's reopened on a Saturday in October. New paint, new carpet, the same tile floor that had witnessed a $5,000 bet and everything that followed. Tony Moretti had retired to Florida, wanting distance from a building that became evidence in a federal case. Elena's name appeared on the ownership documents, the product of a legitimate business arrangement Dominic had structured before his arrest, delivered by his lawyer in the courthouse hallway minutes after the verdict. A final gift from a man who planned for every contingency, including his own absence. The restaurant became a symbol of second chances. Elena hired from the neighborhood, kept Tony's menu but added her grandmother's recipes mole alongside chicken parmigiana, horchata next to house red. On the south side, survival had always required blending. She completed her master's degree in December. Her thesis examined moral ambiguity in Latin American literature. Rolfo's ghosts, Allende's women who committed terrible acts for beautiful reasons, Garcia Marquez's colonels carrying cruelty and dignity in the same pocket. Her advisor noted unusual depth when Elena discussed characters straddling darkness and light. "You write about moral compromise as though you've lived it," Dr. Shaw commented, her tone professional, her eyes holding questions she would never ask. Rosa's recovery progressed steadily. The specialized treatment had arrested the disease. She walked now slowly, with a cane, but upright. The medical foundation Dominic established continued coverage, its funding legitimate, untouchable by the proceedings that dismantled the rest of his empire. Elena expanded the foundation toward families facing similar crises, a bridge between the guilt of how she'd acquired the means and the good those means could accomplish. Twice a month, she drove to federal prison in Marion, Illinois. They talked in English about the foundation, in Spanish about books, in both languages about everything and nothing. Their relationship defied categorization. Not friendship, the history was too heavy. Not romance, the circumstances forbade it. Something beyond either, forged by experiences too profound to abandon. "You could have disappeared with the money," Dominic said during one visit, his face thinner, but eyes still sharp. "Instead, you built something lasting from the wreckage of my mistakes. We're defined not by our worst moments or best intentions, but by what we choose to build after everything falls apart." Back at Moretti's, Elena introduced weekly Latin cultural nights, live music, poetry in 2 languages, cooking demonstrations where neighborhood abuelas taught dishes from Puebla and Guerrero to college students who'd never crossed south of Roosevelt Road. Her linguistic talents, once used to navigate cartel negotiations, had evolved into bridge building between worlds that existed side by side in the same city and rarely intersected peacefully. Elena's graduation fell on the same week as Rosa's one-year remission anniversary, twin celebrations of perseverance through the impossible. Rosa sat in the front row, cane against her knee, tears flowing freely down cheeks that had regained their color. She didn't know the full story of how her treatment was funded. Some truths were better carried by those strong enough to bear them. Crossing the stage, Elena spotted Vivian Cross in the back row, no wig, no contacts. Just a single nod, acknowledging their shared role in transforming wreckage into something with potential for good. Then Vivian left, quiet as always. The literature department offered Elena a teaching position, translation studies, and cultural interpretation. International students filled her workshops, drawn by an authenticity no textbook could provide. They didn't know their professor's expertise came from negotiations where a mistranslated word could end a life. They only knew that when Elena Vasquez spoke about the power of language, she made it feel urgent and real. Dominic's legitimate businesses continued through his trusts, providing jobs and stability in communities his empire had once exploited. Redemption didn't come through erasing past sins, but through creating future possibilities that might tip the scales toward balance. His letters arrived twice monthly from Marion. Philosophy, guilt, purpose conversations. Elena wove into her research, exploring what happens when protecting loved ones collides with the laws society builds to maintain order. On quiet evenings at Moretti's, after the last customer left and the kitchen went dark, Elena sometimes stood alone in the empty dining room and remembered. The corner table, the charcoal suit, the arrogant laugh. $5,000 offered as a joke by a man who didn't know he was meeting the person who would alter his life just as he would alter hers. The memory no longer carried bitterness. It stood as the catalyst for a transformation. Neither could have anticipated a bet never really about money, a language never really about words, and two people who discovered that human beings are rarely what they first appear to be. He challenged her to speak his language. In the end, they learned each other's, and the language that mattered most was neither English nor Spanish, but the silent understanding that redemption isn't a destination. It's the decision to keep building after everything falls apart. Thank you for staying with this story to the very end. Elena and Dominic remind us that life doesn't divide neatly into heroes and villains, that the people who change us arrive in unexpected forms, and the choices we make when love and survival pull in opposite directions are what truly define us. How did this story make you feel? Has there been a moment in your life where doing the right thing and protecting someone you love seemed impossible to do at the same time? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one, and your reflections from deep within your hearts inspire us to keep creating. If this story moved you, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. A like and share help us reach more hearts that need stories like this. We wish everyone watching good health, joyful days, and peace in your hearts. Take care of yourselves and the people you love. Goodbye for now. See you in the next video.